So we're really glad to be able to talk to you today about translating energy into action, and specifically in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. So there's been a ton of work that's been done about implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in corporate environments. And we're starting to see two major issues come out of those. A lot of the work that has been done positions DEI as needing a special approach or a different approach to any other business strategy. And what that does for some leaders in some organizations is it makes DEI feel inaccessible or something that they are uncomfortable with implementing because it's outside of the scope of their normal business. What happens then is that those businesses tend to focus on surface level DEI initiatives that improve their reputation or their social position, without investing in the work of improving the underlying issues that might be existing in their organization. So what we wanted to do was take a look at the fundamental principles behind DEI implementation and see if we could construct a way of approaching it that appeals directly to those individuals who are currently disengaged. So who are we in this context? My name is Margaret Rowan. I am the co-chair of the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Council at Delta Dental of Arkansas in the United States. Prior to that, I was a physics professor for about a decade in Southeast London in the UK. And I moved to the United States about 5 years ago and kind of found my niche in the DEI community here.
And I'm Randy Massengale. I started the diversity program at Microsoft in the 90s. I've since become an entrepreneur and an adjunct professor at Seattle University. I also am serving as the Chief Human Resources Officer at Delta Dental. And today we're going to talk about the genesis of our program and how it relates to the actual process of physics as it relates to organizational development. Okay. When we talk about diversity, all types of ideas flow, and it can range from social justice to talent acquisition to activism. We have everything from affirmative action, but what we really want to do is be able to move from the compliance aspects of diversity and equity and inclusion to the competitive access or the competitive landscape. That means that we want to bring these different philosophies to bear on how we can enhance the company's performance through understanding and valuing differences. Okay. The question is, how can you implement a successful DEI program in spaces that see DEI solely as a social issue? We talked about moving from compliance to competitiveness and enhancing the company's performance. How do you get people to disengage their thinking about the traditional DEI and get them to engage what the future can be in terms of DEI? Okay? Who are we trying to reach? Well, we want to take those passionate employees that we all have around DEI. We also want to address the unsure leadership, people that may not have DEI as a priority, and yet they're decision makers in the company, and we want to bring them together in a meaningful DEI initiative. So we take these factions that sometimes don't agree on what DEI's purpose is or what its effectiveness will be in the organization, and we bring them together for a meaningful effort.
So Randy and I have been discussing this early on in our relationship at Delta Dental of Arkansas, and we have been trying to figure out how we do that, because Delta Dental in Arkansas is very much emblematic of this sort of organization. We have a mission to improve the oral health of all Arkansans, but ultimately most of our decisions are driven by the business need, and a lot of our senior leadership don't reflect the diverse makeup of our employee group. So if we had staffed our DEI initiative with the traditional subject matter experts and leaders at the organization, we would have missed out on a huge pool of talent that have the passion and the drive for this kind of work. And we realized during the course of one of those conversations that we were talking about the generation of this group in pretty much the same way that I used to talk to my students about the generation of mass in the early universe. And actually, when we drilled into that, we were talking about the same concepts undergoing the same process. And that could be a way of reframing the conversation for people who aren't swayed by the current language and the current approaches. So if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to briefly recap the creation of mass in the universe. I apologize if anybody has a physics background. This is going to be very, very brief. But early universe, what you have is you have a sea of energy that is undefined. It is hot, it is dense, it is traveling in all directions at the speed of light. And this makes it extremely difficult for energy to interact in any meaningful way with other pieces of energy, because there's no real direction there and there's no real meaning or structure to it. And this is what we see in Einstein's famous E=mc² equation, is that if we're going to create mass in the universe, we need to have a way of manipulating energy to enable it to interact long enough for the forces that would normally drive it apart to be overcome, for bonds to be formed that will hold mass together. And what you find is that this is achieved in the early universe through the Higgs field. Now, you might be familiar with the Higgs field from a couple of years ago when the scientists at CERN announced the discovery of the Higgs boson. But essentially, the Higgs field functions as a net in space that slows energy down from a rate of constant acceleration to a rate of stable momentum. And what that does is it allows the Higgs boson, which is an associated particle with the Higgs field, to act as a kind of sticking point, a kind of lighthouse around which energy can accumulate. And as it accumulates around the Higgs boson, it will start to interact with itself, with other forms of energy that share complementary properties. And over time, this is a slow process, it took 370,000 years in the early universe, but over time, that interaction between energy will start to form bonds that overcome the forces that drive it apart. And you will eventually end up with a physical manifestation of that interaction in the form of mass. So if you want mass in the early universe, or in the universe at all, you need to create an environment where energy can interact for long enough to overcome the forces that will drive it apart and will allow it to maintain and continually interact over time to maintain its structure. So how does that work with DEI? Well, it turns out every single one of the things that I just said maps directly to the components that you need to have a successful DEI initiative. You can take energy. So energy is people like Randy, people like me, people who have a passion for DEI in your organization. Now, it's important to note, we don't have to have the same passion. Randy's focus is in racial inequity. My focus is in LGBTQ+ inequity, but it is complementary. And it's that complementary element that's going to allow us to combine to create a stronger force. But in order for us to do that, we have to create a DEI Higgs field, an environment that will allow us to interact and exchange our ideas, exchange our passion, without worrying about any of the normal issues that come up in a workplace environment. Randy's the Chief HR Officer at Delta Dental of Arkansas. I'm an individual contributor. Under normal conditions, we would not be able to interact in a way that allows me to challenge him to challenge me, and fundamentally grow. And that's the function of our Higgs field. From the Higgs field, you're going to find that you identify your Higgs boson, a catalyst, maybe an individual, maybe an event, that allows the group as a whole to become stronger and grow from within so it can start to actually have a physical manifestation, a physical impact on the business as a whole. There are some other components as well that you need to account for as a leader. You need to ensure that your group, once it has formed, has the ability to continuously exchange energy between each other. So if we're tackling an issue that's more Randy's area of focus, I'm going to be contributing energy to that, but he's going to be driving it. My area of focus, the reverse. And that's our glue-on component, keeping the group together under the right conditions And this is another function of leadership. Right up at the beginning, leadership establishes the right conditions for the group to be successful. That might be establishing a budget. That might be defining autonomy for the group. It might be establishing its role in the organizational decision-making moving forward. But those conditions are going to allow for sustained particle interaction over time and avoid our annihilation, where our mutually exclusive priorities collide and ultimately the group falls apart. And what we found is that we can express this as an equation. This is the key part of what we looked into, is this equation allows you, if you account for each of the factors, to have a successful DEI initiative in your organization. Your action is going to be the sum of all of the individual motivations of your members, usually raised to the power of your catalyst. That's your Higgs boson, could be internal, could be external, but it's that little spark that drives personal motivation from intrinsic to extrinsic. But you also need to then have the right social conditions, the right access, so that's not just access to people, but it's also access to resources, and then commitment both internally and externally. If you can identify each of these factors and allow them to interact in this way, you will have a successful DEI initiative. So in practice, that can look like a number of different things. There are some real-world examples of this that, when you look at it through this lens, really show the power of that equation. The American Civil Rights Movement is a good example of that. So you start with the individual motivations, primarily driven by returning African American soldiers at the end of World War II, who were coming back to Jim Crow era United States. That is a huge motivating factor for them to take their internal desire for equity and push it into the external space. You've got some catalysts that go along with that, different catalysts along the road, but things like the Supreme Court ruling on Brown versus the Board of Education, the establishment of the NAACP, the activism of Rosa Parks, all of these things act as catalysts to increase that intrinsic motivation. But then you also have social conditions. 50s and 60s, protest is becoming more accepted as a viable form of social change. You have access, increasing media, radio, TV, newspapers, messages can get further, and then you have commitment from leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, people who are driving the change. Every one of those factors leads to a successful initiative, in that case, the establishment of the Civil Rights Act in the United States. So for us at Delta Dental, we also put this into practice. So we started with an application process. How did we identify our energy carriers? We had an application process open to all employees at all levels. And the key feature was they had to have a desire and passion for DEI work, even if it wasn't their normal job. We then established a DEI Higgs field, so a space where it didn't matter who you were, it didn't matter what your role was in the organization. We are going to engage on the same level, and initially, for about 6 months, would you say?
Yes.
We had no outcomes from that work. We just worked on building the relationship. And that was a decision made by leadership to allow that to happen, to create that environment where we could do that and build trust over time so that eventually we could identify our Higgs boson. That ended up being me. I stepped up as an individual who could use my voice to speak up for the other people in the group who weren't as confident. And when that was received well by leadership, it then increases the ability of the rest of the group to contribute and communicate and be part of the discussion. Next up, we had to ensure our conditions were favorable. So to ensure that we could continue to be successful, we had to establish that every member of the group could contribute and could participate. It became an expectation of their leader they would be allowed to spend time on DEI initiatives away from their regular job duties. And then we reduced our annihilation factors by looking at what might drive us apart as a group and doing the best that we could to reduce that. So establishing our autonomy, ensuring that we had release time, or when priorities were competing, someone else could step up and take over. And all of that has led to us being pretty successful up to this point in an environment where the classical approaches wouldn't have worked.
So what comes next in terms of looking at DEI from a different perspective? And so we talked about the physics of it. The next thing we're going to look at is the chemistry. How do you get people to work together? How do you get people to be themselves and yet be part of a greater initiative? We look at the biology of it. What physically happens to the individuals as it relates to their development? It's amazing to see the confidence level in people rise. It's amazing to see them take on more assignments. If something physically happens to them as they engage and become more successful with DEI. And then finally, the organization. We talked about being able to enhance the organization's performance through understanding and valuing differences. So this is the area, if you're interested a little bit further in talking with us, we can be reached at these email addresses, and we want to thank you and take any questions that you have.